If you want to build the best Finan team possible, it can probably be very overwhelming trying to decide where you want to invest your pulls into. Should you dump everything into Finan's Eidolons, or should you prioritize his supports more? Everyone says Sunday's Lightcone is broken, so does that mean you should prioritize Sunday's Lightcone over Finan's Lightcone? If you're on a low budget, is Finan's Lightcone more important than his first Eidolon? I've done plenty of Finan testing, exploring the different avenues in which you can invest into Finan and his teams. So here are my conclusions on the best path to invest your pulls into if you want to make the best possible choices in building the best possible Finan team. When Finan's banner drops, Sunday will be running right alongside him. But what if I told you I don't want you prioritizing either of them? Or at the very least, I want you to keep one other character in mind before you decide to spend all your savings. Cerydra is right around the corner, and she's a wind harmony unit. While harmony characters are generally strong buffers all around, Hoyo has a tendency to want to push certain synergies between specific DPS characters and supports that release around the same time, such as Tribi with the Herda and Casterus, and Anaxa and Hyacine with the two of them as well. In other words, it's highly likely that Cerydra is going to be incredibly powerful for Finan specifically. I'm not saying to actually prioritize her above all else, but I want to mention her first to make sure you keep her in mind while deciding what to do with your pulls. She's the second half of 3.5, so you will be able to save up at least one 5-star pity by the end of her banner. So here's my advice. However you plan to spend your investments into Finan or Sunday's banners, make sure you have enough left over going into 3.5 that you can guarantee Cerydra along with the pulls we'll get in 3.5. With Cerydra out of the way, let's talk about Finan versus Sunday. First off, if you weren't aware, Sunday is Finan's current best support at the moment. Check out my Finan team building guide, linked in the description below, if you need a full chart of Finan's best teammates. Check out my Finan build guide while you're at it, if you need to know how to build and speed tune his teams. Anyway, Finan versus Sunday. Already, this is a dilemma. Obviously, if you're looking to invest in the best possible Finan team, then Finan himself is the #1 priority. However, I will say that Sunday is such a universal and powerful character that if you want to prioritize overall flexibility and usability and longevity on your account, Sunday is probably the more important pull. So it's all a matter of whether or not you're more concerned with focusing on Finan or focusing on your overall account value. But since this is a Phainon Pulling Priority video, let's assume Finan is the priority, and thus, we'll assume that the first thing you do with the 3.4 banners is pull Finan. Now, what next? You can certainly just stop there and wait for Cerydra as I previously suggested. You don't need to invest more pulls into Finan or even into Sunday's banner if that would put you at risk of not getting Cerydra. If you have enough pulls to keep investing further though, and you want to invest further, then it brings up the question, Finan's Eidolons, Finan's Lightcone, or Sunday? The most powerful upgrade for Finan at the current moment by far is his second Eidolon, the classic Hoyo E2 bait. We've seen it with Acheron, we've seen it with Firefly, we've seen it with the Herta, and Hoyo is not breaking this pattern because here it is again with Finan. This E2 is genuinely so ridiculous to the point where it feels like Finan was partially balanced around how powerful it is. On average, in non-AoE scenarios, this E2 translates to an extra meteor and 4 extra turns within his ultimate, which is a lot of extra damage. Going straight for Finan's E2 is the most powerful investment for Finan. However, it is also the most expensive, costing upwards of 300 pulls to guarantee 2 more copies of him for E2. If you don't have enough pulls to go all the way to E2 while also being able to save up for Cerydra, then we need to look at the cheaper upgrade options, which once again comes down to his E1 versus his signature Lightcone versus Sunday. First off, let's talk about Finan's E1 versus his signature Lightcone and what they each offer him. Finan's E1 gives him a ramping 24% increase to the base speed of his ultimate's countdown timer. It requires killing 24 enemies, so you're pretty much only going to see this max number in Pure Fiction. Outside of Pure Fiction, you won't get the full value of this speed buff. Not that it's a bad thing for his E1 to increase his strength in Pure Fiction. Additionally, it gives him 50% crit damage, which really isn't the biggest increase in the world considering how oversaturated Finan already is in crit damage buffs, but hey, more buffs is more buffs. Now, Finan's Lightcone increases his base speed by 12. How does this compare to his E1 in terms of buffing the speed of his ultimate's countdown timer? At max stacks, his E1 increases the speed much more, and it's not even close. But the ramping time and the enemy kill count requirement of course stops it from having an immediate impact outside of Pure Fiction. In order for Finan's E1 to match the base speed increase of his Lightcone, he would need to kill 8 enemies. Once Finan kills 8 enemies with his E1, then his E1's speed increase will overtake the value of the 12 base speed from his Lightcone. And naturally, the more kills he gets with his E1, the more speed value it gains. It should be noted that the way he needs to ramp up stacks for this speed buff means it's starting out slower, and actually needs to ramp up even more to equalize for the slower start compared to his Lightcone giving 12 base speed right off the bat. However, outside of Pure Fiction, are you killing 8 enemies? Maybe sometimes, especially in the recent AoE heavy environment we've had lately, but the endgame is not going to be AoE focused forever. In fact, fact, let me tell you right now that the Memory of Chaos releasing alongside Finan is absolutely not AoE focused. As for how important the speed on his Lightcone is, let's just say that if Finan doesn't have the base speed on his Lightcone, then the speed requirements of his supports becomes much more drastic if you need them to still be in the same cycle as him when he exits his first ultimate. Again, watch my build guide video in the description for the full rundown on speed tuning in Finan teams and the importance of meeting specific speed thresholds on his supports, and how his Lightcone helps his supports immensely. The second his E1 isn't able to gain more speed value than his Lightcone, which is in any scenario where you aren't killing more than 8 enemies within his first few turns, the value of his E1 immediately falls behind his Lightcone. And we haven't even discussed the other benefits to his Lightcone yet. First off is the monstrously high base attack of his Lightcone. It's the highest base attack Lightcone in the game, and Hoyo knows what they're doing because Finan actually has a very low base attack for a main DPS, which is conveniently fixed by his Lightcone. Granted, he gets quite a lot of attack buffs in his kit anyway, so his low base attack genuinely isn't as big of a deal as you might have heard people make it out to be, but it's still something worth noting. The Lightcone then lets Finan ignore 18% of the enemy's defense and increases his damage by 60%. He gets a lot of damage percent as well, so it's not the craziest damage increase, just like the crit damage from his E1, but I want to talk about that 18% defense ignore part of his Lightcone for a bit. Defense ignore is a stat that gets more valuable the higher it gets. Maybe that sounds stupid because obviously every stat gets better if you have more of it, but defense ignore especially gets more valuable the closer you get to 100% defense ignore, especially because it tends to be a more rare or unique stat. It rarely gets oversaturated in the ways crit damage buffs or attack buffs or damage percent buffs can be found just lying under your pillow at night. And here's the thing, Hoyo is aware of this. This is why defense ignore is notorious for being a high investment stat in Hoyo games, especially in HSR. Hoyo notoriously dangles more sources of defense ignore in the higher Eidolons or Lightcones or just general higher investments of teams in order to bait players into assembling all the different defense ignore sources like the Infinity Stones to get that number as close to 100% defense ignore as possible. Let's look at the most infamous example, break teams. Firefly's E1, 15% defense ignore. Fugue's skill, 18% defense reduction. Lingsha's E1, 20% defense reduction. Runmay's E1, 20% defense ignore. Break relic set, defense ignore. Boot Hill E1, defense ignore. Boot Hill Lightcone, defense ignore. Rappa E1, defense ignore. Wow, would you look at that? Hoyo crammed defense ignore everywhere they could afford to with break teams in order to entice you to put the puzzle pieces together to reach as close to 100% defense ignore as possible. All of this to say, Hoyo is very intentional with how they hand out defense ignore as a stat to characters because they want you to invest into defense ignore in order to get it as close to 100% defense ignore as possible because it's just so powerful. So why would they make the defense ignore on Finan's Lightcone so small? The answer should be obvious. It's because defense ignore will be a stat offered to him by his future teammates. We've already seen from the break team archetype how they put bits and pieces of defense ignore on multiple different places in the team in order to entice you to invest into all of them. The 18% defense ignore on Finan's Lightcone is very likely a sign that it'll be the same for him. Don't believe me? We can already look at the E1 of his current best support, Sunday, as proof. 16% defense ignore on Sunday's E1, since Finan can't make use of the second part of his E1. They're already selling some parts of the defense ignore, and it's safe to say that you can expect more sources of it to be scattered throughout Finan's future teammates. And what if they don't? Hoyo has one instance of doing this, where they gave a character one source of defense ignore and didn't even try to sell it on their future teammates. And that character is Fei Xiao. And you want to know what they did? They made Fei Xiao's Lightcone give a whopping 54% defense ignore all on its own. Yeah, if Hoyo isn't going to sell defense ignore in other places in a character's best team, then the baseline defense ignore that they get will be way higher. Therefore, the fact that Finan's defense ignore in his Lightcone is much more similar to the numbers that the break characters were getting should tell you that they're waiting to give him more ways to get closer to that coveted 100% defense ignore. Hi Cerydra. So, all of this to say, it's very likely that the 18% defense ignore in his Lightcone gains value in the future, making it a deceptively better damage increase than it might currently seem, even though it isn't bad by any means, even at the current moment. On top of all this, Finan's Lightcone is on average going to cost less pulls than his E1, since the Lightcone banner pity is more forgiving than the character banner pity. With all of these upsides, Finan's Lightcone ends up as a more valuable pull than his E1. Sunday is also more valuable than his E1, so this leaves us at the crossroads of Finan's Lightcone versus Sunday. With his Lightcone, Finan is more than capable of clearing content in a very low amount of cycles with a completely accessible team of Branya, RMC, and Tingyan, and one of those slots can eventually be given to Cerydra in the future. However, this isn't to say Sunday is bad by any means. Sunday is by far Finan's best support in terms of combining comfort and ultimate stacking and damage. Some characters beat him out in damage buffing, but it's the way Sunday combines all of these things into one all-rounder character that makes him so valuable. That alone makes Sunday competitive with Finan's Lightcone. However, Finan's Lightcone Lightcone is theoretically cheaper than Sunday. Here's what I would say the tiebreaker is. Sunday as a Harmony unit is so flexible in so many other teams, and he can find so many uses on your account beyond just being used with Finan. If that's something that you care about, then Sunday should be your priority after Finan. If you don't care about using Sunday with other characters because, I don't know, your other team is a fully invested casterist team, and thus Sunday's flexibility doesn't mean much to you, then even then, he's still competitive with Finan's Lightcone, and thus wins out overall in terms of priority. But again, due to the fact that the character banner is more costly than the Lightcone banner, it's perfectly fine if that's the deciding factor that makes you decide on Finan's Lightcone. I'm more interested in giving you the analysis and the pros and cons to help you make the most informed decision possible based on your account situation, rather than straight up telling you something is universally better when it really isn't. It really depends. So let's say you went with Sunday over Finan's Lightcone, or let's say you already had Sunday from his first banner. Do you aim for Finan's Lightcone now, or Sunday's Lightcone? Well, Sunday's Lightcone is famous for a reason. The SP positivity it brings is so valuable to so many teams, and the way its damage percent buff works makes it effortless to maintain. Meanwhile, we've already gone over all the benefits of Finan's Lightcone. So here's the thing. While Sunday's Lightcone is indeed incredibly powerful and comfortable, there are ways of managing skill point issues in Finan teams, such as using some rotations with Bronya basic attacks, or even using the Passerby set. And while the damage bonus of Sunday's Lightcone is nice, Finan's Lightcone is basically the damage buffing of Sunday's Lightcone and Sunday's E1 combined. Take all of this into account alongside the speed benefits and base attack of his Lightcone, and Finan's Lightcone is more valuable for him than Sunday's Lightcone. But here's the other thing. While Finan's Lightcone is better for Finan teams, it's very possible that for your account, Sunday's Lightcone is the more valuable pull because Sunday can be utilized on other teams, and his Lightcone is very, very strong for many other teams. Therefore, it's going to depend on your account and what your personal priority is. Finan's Lightcone is better for Finan teams, but Sunday's Lightcone could be better for your overall account. Now, what about Sunday's E1 versus Sunday's Lightcone? While Sunday's E1 is nice because it further stacks the defense ignore, which we already compared to being like assembling the Infinity Stones, one caveat we have to mention with assembling defense ignore in Finan teams is that it is technically making a lot of assumptions about what his future teammates will bring. We can't actually be certain they'll have defense ignore in their kit, and if they do, it could be locked behind more Lightcones and Eidolons. If the defense ignore was the only good part of Finan's Lightcone, then it wouldn't be worth it. Finan's Lightcone is good because of the sum of all its parts: the defense ignore, damage bonus, and base attack and base speed. The assumptions we made about future teammates having defense ignore was only one piece of the puzzle that made Finan's Lightcone more valuable than his E1. Sunday's E1 is only the 16% defense ignore, since Finan can't make use of the 40%. And mind you, even if a support were to come out that attached a summon to Finan, Finan would still only get the 16% defense ignore. The 40% defense ignore part of Sunday's E1 only applies to the summon itself, and not the character attached to the summon. So with all that said, I would put Sunday's E1 at the lowest priority at this current moment. If things change and we discover that Cerydra gives like 50% defense ignore at a baseline and also trivializes skill points, which would make Sunday's E1 way more valuable to Finan than his Lightcone, then we'll talk about that some other time. But for now, here is the final, definitive pulling priority order and how to invest in your Finan team. Finan's E2 is by far his strongest investment for relatively low cost, but it's still not that low cost in terms of how many pulls it'll take on average. If you can't go all the way to his E2, then look to invest in the other things on this priority list first. Skipping Sunday and Finan's Lightcone to go for Finan's E2, only to end up with E1 Finan and neither Sunday or his Lightcone, is not a scenario you want to find yourself in. After his E2 is his best support, Sunday, who is just all around a valuable pull for your account, alongside Finan's Lightcone being a situationally better route to take solely due to being cheaper on average than a brand new character. Of course, if you already had Sunday, then Finan's Lightcone is the easy choice. Afterwards, it becomes Sunday's Lightcone as the next priority. And then, well, Finan's E1 and Sunday's E1 should never make it here onto the priority list. Because if you went through all of the previous priorities and you still have enough to consider either of their first Eidolons, then you probably should have just skipped all of the other priorities and gone straight for Finan's E2 anyway. And keep in mind throughout all of this, that saving enough leftover Jades for Cerydra is also high on the priority list. We'll have early information on Cerydra, as well as Cerydra's vertical investment priorities, such as her Lightcone or Eidolons, by the time Finan and Sunday's banner arrives. So maybe hold off on investing immediately into their banners beyond one copy of Finan, and wait for my first impressions video on Cerydra. But if you want to know the best avenue to invest into Finan and Sunday's banners right off the bat, this is the current priority. Thank you so much for watching. I know pulling priority plans are vital for players who are looking to invest further into their favorite characters, but aren't sure what the best way to use their pulls are. So I hope this helped you come to a more informed decision about how you want to spend your pulls. Again, my goal here isn't to tell you what to do with your account, but rather to provide you the pros and cons and the information necessary for you to understand what's best for your personal situation, because so much of this depends on your account and your current characters and what you care most about doing with your account. So I hope this video was informative and helpful. If you enjoyed the video, consider liking, and be sure to comment down below what your plans are with how to spend your pulls in patch 3.4. Since pulling priority can be so situation dependent, comment down below with your account situation, and I can try and help you come to an even more informed decision if you need more advice. I stream over on Twitch and post over on Twitter, and I'm also on Discord, so reach out to me on any of those platforms to have your questions even further expanded on, if you'd like to hear more of my opinions. I still have more Finan content in the works, and I'll have plenty of upcoming content covering Cerydra and how she'll change everything for Finan. So be sure to subscribe to the channel to make sure you don't miss any of that. Again, thank you so much for watching, and I wish you all the best of luck with your Finan pulls, no matter how you plan to spread them out. Until next time!